Crocodile dragged the bull into the river. Then the fisherman's son dived in. The bull let out a thunderous, guttural cry that sliced through the heavy air like a blade. Water exploded around its hooves, a violent spray of mud and foam, as something massive and unseen slammed into it from below. The river churned like boiling oil, and in a heartbeat, Torque, the village's prized Brahmin bull, was no longer just standing at the water's edge. He was fighting for his life. Darien Cull's breath caught in his throat as he froze, half-crouched behind the slanted trunk of a crooked palm. Just moments earlier, the 12-year-old had trailed the sound of splashing from the jungle path, barefoot and curious, gripping the smooth wooden shaft of his fishing spear. Now, his eyes were locked wide with horror as he watched the creature rise from the depths. It came up fast, too fast, just a ripple, then a wave, and suddenly, jaws. Long, green-black, jagged jaws snapped around the bull's hind leg with a sound like cracking lumber. Torque bellowed, high and panicked, and lurched backward, straining the thick rope tied to a stone peg driven deep into the riverbank. But the force that pulled against him was older, stronger, ancient. Darien's hands clenched around the spear. His heart thumped against his ribs like a trapped bird. The water frothed violently as the crocodile twisted, dragging Torque sideways into the deeper channel. The bull's front hooves scrabbled at the mud, flinging chunks of earth behind it, but it was already halfway in. "Dad!" Darien screamed, but his father was nowhere nearby. Hal Cull had taken the canoe upstream earlier that morning to mend nets at a quieter spot. Darien was alone. The scream died in his throat. Torque's eyes locked on him, wild, full of pain and pleading, and the rope tied around its neck snapped taut as the crocodile gave another heave. It was pulling the bull under. Darien didn't think. He dropped his spear, ran down the slope, and threw himself into the water. The river was colder than he expected. It punched into his chest and robbed him of air, its current grabbing at him like fingers. He kicked hard, eyes open, trying to see through the murky green. Bubbles and blood swirled past his face. He could just make out the blurred form of Torque's massive flank beneath the surface, the rope trailing loosely in the water, and something darker wrapped tight around one leg. Darien surged forward, reaching for the rope. His fingers brushed it, caught, and gripped tight. He pulled himself hand over hand toward the bull's halter, ignoring the ache in his muscles and the pull of the current. The bull thrashed wildly, nearly striking him with a hoof, but he ducked low and grabbed hold of the leather strap just behind Torque's ears. His chest burned. He kicked toward the surface and broke through, gasping, clutching the bull's head as both of them floated, barely. "Hold on, Torque, hold on!" he cried, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the bull or himself. Then the water beneath them shifted. It wasn't just turbulence. It was deliberate. A deep, low motion, like something rising. Darien's breath caught again. He twisted in the water, still gripping Torque's halter, and saw it. Another shadow, larger, thicker. It moved under them like a passing barge. But this one wasn't headed for the bull. It was coming for him. The realization hit like a slap. One croc was pulling down the bull. But this one? It was targeting the only other warm body in the water. Him. "No!" Darien gasped. Panic surged through him. He let go of Torque, kicked back, and reached toward the riverbed for anything solid. His fingers found a smooth rock. He grabbed it, twisted, and hurled it with every bit of strength he had at the dark shape beneath the surface. The splash was loud, too loud. The water exploded again, but not from his rock. The crocodile was already mid-lunge. Darien flung himself sideways as a snout broke the surface right where he had been. Teeth snapped shut with a wet crunch. He thrashed, fighting to stay afloat, but his limbs felt like wet cloth. His ears rang from the impact. He was going to drown. He was going to... A loud crack shattered the chaos. A flare streaked through the air and struck the water just ahead of the crocodile's head. It hissed and recoiled, diving instantly. Darien blinked through the spray, coughing. A rope landed just beside him, slapping the surface. "Grab it, boy!" a voice shouted from the far bank. "Now!" Darien didn't hesitate. He reached, missed, kicked, reached again, and caught it. Strong hands pulled from the other end as he kicked with the last of his energy. Mud squelched beneath his feet as he was yanked onto solid ground. He collapsed on the bank, choking on river water, coughing up leaves and mud. His arms trembled. His legs felt like wood. He rolled onto his side and retched. Then a hand touched his shoulder. "You're lucky you're not in two pieces," the man said. His voice was rough, cracked like dry leather. Darien looked up through blurry eyes to see a gaunt face with a thin gray beard and sun-darkened skin. The man's waders were torn and muddy, his belt loaded with knives and pouches. "Boy, what in the world possessed you to jump in after that beast?" Darien could barely speak. It had my father's bull, Torque." The man nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the river. "So that was Torque. Poor thing never stood a chance." Darian followed his gaze. The water was calm again, no thrashing, no sounds, just a faint swirl of red dissolving near the center. Torque was gone. I tried to pull him out, Darian said, shaking. But then another one came. It went for me. I thought, you saw too? The man asked sharply, cutting him off. Darian nodded. The first one had Torque, but the second one, it was bigger. The man crouched beside him. His voice dropped. That's worse than I thought. Who are you? Darian asked, still catching his breath. The man took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. Name's Brannock. I live out past the West Marsh. You Cull's boy? Darian nodded again. Brannock looked out across the water and shook his head. That wasn't just any croc that took your bull. That was Khazar. The name hung in the air like fog. Darian frowned. Khazar? Brannock's eyes darkened. A monster. The old ones talk about him. 20 years he's haunted these waters. Big, smart, fast. Seen men vanish in seconds. Thought he'd moved on, but looks like he's still around. Darian hugged his knees, trying to stop the shivering. His mind replayed the moment the second crocodile surged toward him. But the bigger one didn't take Torque. It came after me. Brannock stared at him a moment. You saw the other one clear? As clear as the water would let me. Brannock leaned forward. Then you didn't just see Khazar. You saw something worse. Maybe his mate, or his rival. Darian swallowed hard. Brannock stood and offered his hand. Come on, boy. Let's get you home before the river claims another. Darian let himself be pulled to his feet, legs wobbling, heart still racing. The bull was gone. The water was still. But something had changed inside him, something sharp and quiet and burning. As they walked back through the tall grass, Brannock's voice dropped to a low murmur, almost a warning. Boy, he said, glancing over his shoulder at the river. That wasn't just any croc. That's Khazar. The name meant nothing to Darian, but the look on Brannock's face chilled him more than the river. You just picked a fight with a monster that's been haunting these waters for 20 years. By the time the sun had dipped behind the ridge of moss-covered trees, the entire village of Crest Hollow buzzed with talk. Darian Cull's name traveled from hut to hut, from fire pit to fish stall. Some called him foolish, others called him brave. But all told the same story, how a boy had leapt into the river to save his father's bull and nearly lost his life to a crocodile that hadn't been seen in 2 decades. Yet while the village found something heroic in it, Darian himself could barely lift his eyes from the ground. He sat on the steps outside their hut, chin on his knees, staring blankly at the darkening sky. The wooden floorboards creaked behind him as his father stepped out, pipe in hand, the smoke curling upward in tired spirals. Hal Cull didn't say anything at first. He stood beside his son, watching the villagers wander back to their homes. Finally, Hal spoke, his voice low and rough. That bull was our only trade-in for a second boat. Darian's stomach turned. He looked up slowly, guilt weighing down every bone in his body. His father's face was unreadable, but his silence hit harder than any shout would have. Now we've got nothing but nets and nightmares, Hal added, exhaling smoke through his nose. Darian nodded, his throat tight. I'm sorry. Hal didn't reply. He turned back toward the doorway, disappearing into the dim light of the hut. Darian sat there for a long time, unmoving, the stars slowly emerging above the reeds. That moment carved itself deep into him, not just the loss of Torque, but the way his father's voice sounded when something broke inside it. The next morning was quiet until the sound of boots crunching over gravel echoed across the clearing. Darian looked up to see Brannock approaching, his coat damp with early dew, his gait slightly slower than usual. He held something in his hand, long and dark. As he neared the hut, he dropped the object onto their small wooden table with a heavy thud. A tooth, as long as Darian's forearm, cracked at the edge, blackened in the middle, with jagged lines running up the root like veins. Pulled it from a trap 10 miles north, Brannock said, his voice as dry as driftwood. Khazar's tooth. Hal emerged from the hut, frowning. He stepped closer, examining the tooth with both hands, turning it slowly. Injured crocs are unpredictable, Hal muttered. They lash out at anything. Brannock nodded grimly. I don't think he's leaving this area, Hal. He's hurt, angry, and too smart to just vanish. He's been spotted further upriver. Might be heading toward the reed farms. Hal looked at him sharply. That's near the ferry docks. Exactly, Brannock said. And if he's moving that way, we don't have long. Darian stood quietly beside the hut, listening. They didn't know he was there. He should have stepped forward. He didn't. Because deep down, something didn't sit right. That night, long after the village lights dimmed and the insects took over the silence, Darian lay in his hammock, eyes open. Sleep wouldn't come. Brannock's words echoed in his head, but more than that, so did the memory of the second crocodile. Bigger, faster, more focused on him than the bull. Why hadn't Brannock mentioned it? Why hadn't he brought it up earlier? Unable to shake the unease, Darian slipped out of the hammock and crept barefoot toward the front steps. His father's voice drifted through the open window, low and cautious. "If Khazar's moving north," Hal said, "he'll hit the outer reed farms next. Then the ferry docks. If he's smart, he'll hunt at night," Brannock added. "But he ain't just hungry anymore. He's angry." There was a pause. Then Hal said, "We'll need bait, and we'll need someone fast enough to set it and get out before Khazar shows." Darian's hands tightened into fists. They were talking about him. He didn't need to hear his name to know. But what they didn't know, what neither of them had said, was that the second crocodile wasn't just some rogue predator. It hadn't been after the bull. It had gone after him. It hadn't been hunting. It had been protecting something. That wasn't an ambush. That was territorial defense. Darian waited until their voices faded and the pipe smoke stopped drifting from the window. Then he slipped away, walking down to the bank where Torque had vanished days earlier. The moon bathed the mud in silver light. The ground was still torn where the bull had tried to resist. Darian crouched beside the indentations, fingers brushing through the cold, wet earth. He found hoof prints, but also something else. Claw marks, not one set, 2, maybe 3. His pulse quickened. These weren't from the same beast. They were smaller, tighter spaced, some fresh, some older. Khazar wasn't alone. If there were multiple crocodiles, maybe offspring, maybe a mate, then this wasn't a matter of one monster haunting the river. This was a nest. Darian stared at the tracks, heart pounding, a plan forming in his mind faster than he could fully grasp it. If Khazar was injured and the others were guarding the territory, then no trap would work. Not if they didn't know where the nest was. And baiting the river would only draw the wrong one. Someone had to find it. Someone had to finish it. The next morning, the villagers met at the square. The plan was simple. Hal and Brannock would take a boat loaded with goat meat upriver to lure Khazar out. The rest of the men would spread out and scout from elevated banks. Darian stood off to the side, quiet, his sling tied around his belt, watching as the plan unfolded. Brannock and Hal loaded the boat carefully, the smell of rot wafting across the clearing. "Stay put, Darian," Hal said, stepping into the canoe. "This isn't your fight." Darian nodded once, but he didn't mean it. As soon as the boat slipped into the current and disappeared around the bend, Darian turned and vanished into the underbrush. He didn't run. He moved carefully, deliberately. He knew the marsh paths well. He had followed his father here since he was small. He crossed the shallow streams, ducked under tangled vines, and reached a patch of thorny palms where no traps were ever laid. He crouched, pulled out his pouch of firestones, tucked it into his belt, and tightened the knot on his sling. His breath was steady, his eyes sharp. He would track them. Not just one, all of them. If there was a nest, he'd find it. If there were more crocodiles, he'd face them. And if Khazar had a family? Darian adjusted the grip on his sling, squinted into the thick trees ahead, and whispered the words like a promise. Find the nest, destroy the threat, and finish what he'd started. Darian moved like a ghost through the fog-covered wetlands, knees slightly bent, feet slipping over mud and moss with practiced silence. The air hung heavy and damp, wrapping around his skin like a wet sheet. Every rustle in the reeds, every plop in the distance made him pause. He wasn't afraid of the dark, but he respected it. Tonight, the marsh didn't feel like home. It felt like something was watching him from beneath the surface, waiting for him to make a single mistake. He crouched near a low bend in the trail and scanned ahead. In the distance, where the river curled into a hollow, he saw it, a sloped bank shrouded in shadow. The dirt there had been disturbed. Reeds flattened. Mud churned. He crept forward, heart knocking against his ribs. When he reached the clearing, he froze. 3 cracked eggshells sat in a messy nest of wet leaves and crushed stalks. They were massive, each bigger than a man's skull. Their interiors were stained with streaks of red and black. Nearby, scattered across the bank, were bones. Some were long and pale, chewed at the ends. One still had scraps of cloth tangled around it. Darian's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer and crouched. A boot, a child's sandal, a crushed water flask, human remains. This wasn't just a nest. It was a feeding ground. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to remember why he was here. He needed to understand Khazar, to learn how to stop him before anyone else died. This spot was proof that the crocodile didn't just attack in defense. It hunted. It fed. And worse, it hoarded. Darian turned to retreat, moving backward through the reeds, each step careful and slow. Then he stepped on something, dry, brittle, snap. The sound echoed louder than it should have. His whole body stiffened. The silence shattered. Behind him, the river exploded upward in a wall of water and scales. Khazar. Darian dove sideways, hitting the ground hard, shoulder slamming against a tree root. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he rolled just in time to see the monster crash where he'd been standing. Khazar's massive tail whipped through the air, sending mud and debris flying. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight, cold, ancient, and focused. Darian scrambled to his feet, heart hammering, and pulled a small pouch from his belt. He struck his firestones fast, sparks catching the oil-soaked resin inside the sling. It ignited in a flash of blue-orange flame. Without hesitation, he swung and hurled it at the beast. The pouch struck Khazar near the eye. Flame burst, and a screech tore from the crocodile's throat. He thrashed wildly, smoke rising from his scorched scales. But just as Darian dared to think he'd turned the tide. Another roar echoed from the riverbank. Darian's eyes snapped left. A second crocodile, smaller but faster, charged through the water, jaws wide. Not Khazar's mate. Darian could tell by the movement. This one was leaner, more aggressive, a rogue, a challenger. Darian's mind raced. This wasn't about him anymore. These two weren't allies. They were enemies. As the rogue lunged for Khazar, the two monsters collided in a spray of water and blood. Their jaws clamped down on each other, tails whipping, claws tearing at scales. The sound was deafening. Darian backed away, but his eyes locked on something he'd buried in the mud earlier. A sharpened wooden stake, 3 feet long, with a carved grip and a hardened tip. Now was his only chance. He sprinted toward the fight. Khazar and the rogue croc rolled through the shallows, locked in a deadly grip. Darian leapt from the side, feet barely touching the ground, and drove the stake downward with all his strength. It pierced the smaller croc's neck just above the shoulder. A spurt of hot blood splashed across Darian's arm. The beast let out a guttural shriek and thrashed violently, nearly throwing Darian off. But he held tight to the shaft until the creature began to shudder, then go still. The rogue slid beneath the surface, twitching, bubbles rising. Darian rolled away, panting, soaked, his body. Darian glanced back at the feeding ground, the bones, the broken eggs, the scorched reeds, and realized he couldn't carry this weight alone. He had to warn the village, tell them everything, about the rogue, the territory war, the nest. They were walking into something far bigger than just a predator. He marked the tree beside the clearing with a quick slash from his knife, left his scorched sling behind as a sign, and took off running. The fog was beginning to lift as he reached the edge of the wetlands. But something felt wrong. Office. The birds had gone quiet. The frogs no longer croaked. The air itself felt tense, like the pause before a storm. As he emerged from the trees and saw the village docks ahead, a sick feeling bloomed in his chest. Something had happened, something he hadn't prepared for. Darian sprinted the last stretch. When he reached the clearing near the water, he skidded to a halt, his worst fears clawing to life. The boat carrying Hal and Brannick had returned, smashed and empty. One paddle floated in the reeds. Torn rope dangled from its hull, and blood smeared the edge of the deck. The village exploded in shouts and confusion. Spears clattered against the ground, nets were unfurled with shaking hands, and voices overlapped in a chorus of fear and desperation. Men sprinted toward the shattered remains of the dock, eyes scanning the reeds and swirling water for any sign of the boy or his father. The river, once calm, now boiled with secrets beneath its surface. Darian didn't waste a second. His heart pounded as he dropped to his knees at the broken edge of the platform, sifting through floating splinters and debris, a scrap of torn shirt, a cracked oar, and then Hal's pendant. It caught the fading sunlight, glinting as it dangled from a broken chain, snagged in a jagged plank. Darian snatched it up, eyes wide, jaw clenched. Brannick was nowhere in sight. "Elric!" someone called, and the thin, grizzled mayor of Galen's Reach stepped into the chaos. His coat flapped in the wind, and his brow furrowed with sharp concern. "Form a search line! West bank to the far shallows!" But Darian had already vanished. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't need them. He followed instinct. Blood smeared across reeds, barely visible in the fading light. Large drag marks carved into the muddy embankment. Flattened stalks and a broken sandal. The trail wound into the thickest part of the marsh, where the sunlight barely reached and the frogs dared not croak. With each step deeper into the reeds, the world grew quieter. Only the wet squelch of his boots, the chirp of insects, and his own breathing kept him company. His fists stayed clenched, one gripping the pendant so tightly it left an imprint in his palm. The other wrapped around the wooden dagger he had used once before. He didn't know what he would find, but he couldn't go back without trying. As the sky deepened to orange, he paused atop a slope where the ground flattened out into a clearing of damp moss and twisted trees. His ears perked. Was that a cough? He turned. "Boy," came a voice, hoarse and brittle. "Behind you." Darian whipped around. A massive tail shot toward him from the underbrush, glistening with marsh slime. He dropped flat just in time, the wind rushing past his face as the spiked end tore through the air where his head had been. The rogue crocodile had returned. It wasn't dead, and it had followed him. Before Darian could scramble away, the beast advanced, its breath loud, nostrils flaring. Its snout was still marked with old scars, and one eye hung half-closed. Its gullet clicked with each slow step forward. But something else moved behind it. Another shadow surged from the water. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees as Khazar, towering, battered but alive, charged the rogue like a fallen tree catching wind. The two crocodiles collided, the shockwave knocking Darian off his feet. They slammed through the tree line, tails thrashing like whips, teeth clamped on snouts. The rogue's jaws snapped and tore, but Khazar fought with precision. He ducked, pivoted, and struck like he knew every move before it came. Darian didn't wait to watch. He crawled toward the voice. Brannick lay behind a mound, shirt torn, his arm wrapped tightly around a bleeding rib. His face was pale, lips cracked, but he was alive. "Your father," Brannick gasped, blinking hard through the pain. "He's alive. Khazar didn't kill him. That other one, the one you stabbed, it turned on him. It saw the meat was gone." Darian's heart twisted. The rogue hadn't just been hunting, it had been betrayed. Hal had escaped the fight, but only barely. And now Khazar was finishing what had started. "I have to go," Darian whispered, helping Brannick lean against a tree. "I'll bring him back. I swear he ran." The trees rushed past him, shadows flickering like ghosts. Branches scraped his arms, but he didn't stop. He reached the marsh's edge just in time to hear a crack, deep, final, and echoing. The rogue's jaw hung open, lifeless, as Khazar wrenched it wide with one final, brutal twist. The beast collapsed, tongue lolling, blood mixing into the river. The fight was over. Khazar, bleeding from his side, limping heavily, turned toward Darian. For a moment their eyes locked. No sound passed between them, but Darian felt something stir inside. Not fear, not pity, recognition. Khazar blinked once, slowly. Then without a sound he turned and slid back into the water, vanishing beneath its surface. A rustling behind the trees made Darian spin again. Hal stumbled into view. His shirt clung to his body, soaked in sweat and blood, his arm gashed and wrapped in a torn piece of cloth. His eyes widened when he saw his son. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked with exhaustion. Darian ran to him, throwing his arms around his father's chest. For the first time in what felt like days, he let the tension fall away. Hal winced but smiled faintly, resting his hand on Darian's shoulder. "You came back," he whispered. "I never left," Darian replied, voice thick. In the days that followed, the village stayed silent. No celebrations, just quiet nods between neighbors and cautious glances toward the river. Warning signs were placed around the marsh, nailed to trees and stone posts. The children were told stories, not just of danger, but of honor, of bravery, of what it meant to dive in. Khazar was never seen again. Some claimed he died from his wounds. Others believed he had simply moved on, returned to whatever place bred monsters like him. But Darian knew the truth. He remembered that final stare. He remembered the stillness in those dark eyes. Khazar had chosen, not to spare him, not to thank him, but to show respect. And the river would never forget. And so the legend grew, not of the crocodile who dragged the bull, but of the fisherman's son who dove in and made the river change its mind.